Okay, so once again, thanks to Sarah from the wonderful group and the opportunity to have a conversation around transitioning. It's great to have everybody on today. And I thought maybe just for folk that will be watching this in time, if we could first go around and everybody just introduce who they are and their thoughts around transitioning and the kind of things that impacted on them. Just a couple of minutes with each person, and maybe a few gems that you can share. So, Patrick, I always pick on you first. Just a gem of wisdom from your transitioning journey. And
Well, my name is Patrick McCurdy. I grew up in law enforcement and still to this day, I'm very passionate about that honorable profession. Um, I spent 32 years in that career myself and retired, not necessarily with my timing or choice. And transition was very difficult, in part because I wasn't prepared for it. But I think even if I was prepared, I wasn't prepared for um, the shedding of pride and ego, which was part of my transition process that I had to go through. And I realized during that process that my entire identity, being raised as the son of police officers, plural, my mom and dad, and nephew and friend and brother and husband to police officers, um, it was very difficult. But I'm really grateful to be on the other side of that because it taught me so much about who I actually am instead of who I said I was, and who I've become since then. And I think that I've become much more kind and intuitive. Although intuition was a part of the profession, it's different now because my intuition deals with helping other people and leaning in and listening to them. And my negative experiences throughout that process and what preceded it with a lot of betrayal and administrative betrayal and all of that, my process made me much more understanding and empathetic to those who are going through a similar process and more relatable. And it gave me the credibility with them to be the person that can listen, that they will seek out. Sometimes more than I'm ready for, but I think that's a good thing to have that dilemma where people are seeking me out for help because that's what I do now. And so um, I think that's the most wisdom that I have regarding that right now. But
good
obviously, as
wisdom.
we talk, I'll share anything that comes up.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. Yeah, no, thanks for
Sure.
that. And I'm thrilled to have you here today, Jason. Jason is just a wonderful friend and a good brother across the continent, and just really glad that he's taken the time to come today. And I know you have had such a varied experience and continue to have an extraordinary journey, Jason. And I'm just wondering what comes to you when we think about transitioning.
Well, I guess if I were to say ditto what Patrick just said, wouldn't suffice. So I am like Patrick. I did not come from a military family or a law enforcement family. I joined the Army when I was 17 as a means to escape the how should I say, the life that was projected that I would have if I remained where I was. And I should say, I ended up getting hurt, and that ended my military career prematurely. Uh, with law enforcement, uh, same type of thing. I ended getting hurt, and so both careers ended before I would have chose to conclude them. And that changed in so many different ways. How it would affect me financially, mentally, and different things like that. But what I look in retrospect is I lost my identities. So as a soldier, I had my role. As a cop, supervisor, leader, trainer, I had my role. But take me out of the two uniforms that I wore, and I really had to define who I was, and that was a struggle. It took a long time. So, say I've been retired from the law enforcement for going on 6 years. I lose track of time. So going on 6 years, and it was a hard journey for me.
Yeah.
Um, and came with depression, things like that. I've looked at another great program, Pain Behind the Badge, and they go over the suicide rates of law enforcement. And literally, I was that prime market right there. I had over 14 years law enforcement. I was in a certain age group, and so my statistics for suicide were very high. And fortunately, I was able to find some groups to help me and pull me out of my blues there. And now I work to help others as well. So it's been a journey, but how should I say? I think that's just the way it will be, a continuous journey. Take every day and
Yeah.
pull me out of that little shell a little bit and get me into the uncomfortable zones, and that's what promotes growth.
Yeah, and I think you really highlight the fact that transitioning is not a journey with a beginning or an end. It circles of beginnings and endings and beginnings and endings. And I think some of those journeys we can cycle in and out of release and growth, and then we can move back into discomfort and pain. And it's this continual processing. It's like into the fire. I always use the image of the Japanese samurai sword, which was something that came to me when I was running. And it's formed by taking this metal, putting it in the fire, you hammer it, you heat it up, hammer it out, fold it back. And it's layers and layers of that till it's this fine, flexible instrument. And I think sometimes the transitioning process, whether it's military or otherwise, is this thing of moving in fires, heating up, hammered, folded back. And it's deeply uncomfortable, but layer after layer after layer starts to form a flexibility within the soul and the body and the mind. But it's not an easy process. It's a complex process, and one sometimes I don't think we like very much. And Sarah, I know you've certainly had a life journey. What are your thoughts around transitioning?
Well, I kind of got into this arena surprisingly. I lost my dad to suicide, and that really gave me a heart to want to get into that arena where people are suffering in silence. And when a veteran shared his story with me, it really made me feel like I just want to get into that gap and help our veterans and first responders not suffer in silence anymore. And I remember hearing a story about a culture, I think it was Native American, when the warriors came back from war, all the people in the tribe would sit there and the warriors could really share their stories. And then that helped as a community, it helped them reintegrate back into regular life. And I think that is such a huge thing that we try to do on the Power of Our Story, is to really invite people to come share their story and connect in a judgment-free zone for that very reason. Like, you don't have to suffer in silence anymore. We're here for you. And so it's wonderful to be here, Barry.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I mean, for me, in terms of my personal journey, as I've said before, is, when I left the war, the Rhodesian Bush War in 1976, 77, those times nothing was defined. We knew nothing about conversations, healing stories, modalities, trauma, PTS. And for me, the transitioning process was just a blast, a chaotic blast into life. And I often say that the first 60 years of my life feel like I was at war. Within that, there were glorious adventures. There was incredible sequence of losses and immigrations and changing of countries and hellos and goodbyes and endings and beginnings. And it's only really from 60 where I started to realize this weight that I carry. And it's like a ball that sits on my shoulders. It takes energy. And probably my journey from that point in my transitioning process, as I became more aware through working with the military, through talking to people, was really an opportunity where I started to have to look at what my healing was. And my healing in the transitioning journey was to really begin to find ways of feeling safer, feeling a greater sense of peace and connectedness, and also beginning to touch the grief and the loss of aspects of the journey. But also part of that was also to start to identify and value the attributes and the values that I brought from that fiery journey, and how important those were, in terms of reliability and dependability and tribe, and learning to put other people first. So it was reclaiming, and I often say the transitioning journey is that rescue back first into getting yourself, and then bringing that forward. And that for me is still a process, So as I said, I don't know if this ever ends. At 70, I'm still in the middle of this journey. I'm still, at times, I feel the weight of what I carry. At times, I feel almost as if the journey stripped away parts of myself that I don't know how to get back. And trying to work out how I can never be who I was, but how I heal those parts that kind of were, stripped away in a lot of the experiences. And as I've often said, it's also about touching the grief, and I don't think that's ever easy. So I thought today, when I was looking at my book and thinking, well, where the hell do I start in this book? I thought maybe to go down to the foundations and consolidate what we started to look at last time. And I thought the first thing in any transitioning journey is to actually start to look at intention. What is your intention? And it reminded me that in 1990, when I took on that mission of running that 84-kilometer ultramarathon uphill, at a cognitive level, I went, this is going to be good. But at an intention level, I wasn't ready for it. And I didn't really know I wasn't ready for it. I thought, this is a great idea. I'm reasonably fit. I'm going to do it. Intention is not formed by cognition. It's not formed by a conscious decision. That's easy to make. Intention's formed by our willingness to actually step into the fires of the journey. And in those fires, and that's very much the samurai blade, going into the fire, being folded back, hammered out. And in that process, we form our intention. And in my book, when I started thinking about what's the process for really critically starting to look at intention, and I thought I'd start off on those today, some of which we touched last time. But the first one, I guess, was, I know when I took on ultramarathon running, I had to look at what was my will to do this, that there was a romantic idea that the loneliness of the long-distance runner, this extraordinary experience of going beyond the limitations of mind and body. But I had to form my will. And the only way I could form my will was in the training. And in the training, when I met the edges of myself, I had to face doubt, uncertainty, fear, vulnerability, and all the negative thinking that went with that as well. And it was only in that battle that I began to be ready to actually run the race. So will is not something that, will is earned. It's earned through going to the very edges of yourself and facing yourself. And I think for all of us transitioning, we get to that point. And often when we're at that point, it's very difficult to reform it on your own. We do need a tribe to surround us, to support us on the way and through that journey. So will, I think, can't be formed alone. It can be formed through adversity and challenge and discomfort, but we need to be surrounded by a circle of people. The second one was, so what is it like when you have to adjust and adapt? And I think for many of us in transitioning, we have patterns of living. And those patterns can be quite entrenched. And as Patrick, you've said many times, is your ability to let go of what you were holding on to. And I think so much of our lives, we've got our fists are closed over the things we hold on to tightly. And part of the growth of being able to walk into change is becoming willing to open your hand and let go of what needs to change, transform, adjust, and adapt from. And I don't think that's easy. As we heard from Mark, his relationship fell apart. I had several of those fall apart. And they were huge losses, and recovering from those losses is not easy. So with will, we face the need to adjust and adapt. And in adjusting and adapting, we often need to let go of what no longer works. And in the letting go of this, it can be extremely painful. It can be extremely exciting as well. And we have to be ready for that. The third one, and this is, by the way, is the WARRIOR acronym. So the W for will and the A for ability to adjust and adapt. The R, when I reflected on it, was our respect first for ourselves. So I know recently, as we saw the conversation around self-compassion, I don't think any of us are very good at self-compassion. I know I have not been, and I'm probably still a long way to go on the journey of transitioning to show self-compassion. I am certainly far more comfortable at the edge of discomfort because that's what's familiar to me. But the problem is that chronology will eventually stop you playing the old games of trying to run ahead and into discomfort, whether it's ultramarathon running, parachuting, extreme sports, or whatever it is. Something's going to stop us at that point. And when we can no longer do the things that numb out or to some extent process, who are we, and now what? How are we going to adjust and adapt at that point? So I think part of respect for oneself is to also look critically on your transitioning journey. Is what may look like it's working, but perhaps also has an edge to it. So for me, I would have always said that ultramarathon running works because no matter what's happening in my world, I process on the run. I process in the silence and the solitude of sitting in my body, and I've got time and space to think about what I'm facing as I'm trying to create change. But also what I had to realize was that thing I was holding on to so tightly was also stopping me from creating change because I was running away from feeling. So we have to be quite careful in what we need to adjust and adapt to. And often that can't be done on our own because it's difficult because we're entrenched in it. And it often takes a mate or support or the appropriate kind of journey with tribe to start to understand how we need to transform. The other one was respect for others. And I think often in the transitioning journey, it can be very painful because we lose ourselves, we lose our location in tribe, we lose our sense of value, our sense of competence. We lose our brothers and our family. And I don't think the emotions that come with that are easy. And if we don't want to touch the grief, I often say anger is a symptom of grief, unresolved. And that anger is going to find a place. And I think the expression that I often use is we bring the war back home. And our family then become the enemy. And so part of the respect for others is that we are willing to do what it takes to heal who we are so we don't replicate the adversity of our transitioning journey and where we've come from. We don't replicate the negative parts of ourselves within our homes and the people we love. It's like I was working with a veteran and I said to him, "So what's happening?" He said, "Yeah, I don't know what to do here." He said, I'm just impossible at home. I'm literally firing off all the time. My kids are running around me on eggshells. My wife is running around me on eggshells, and I don't know how to stop it." And I said to him, when you were in Afghanistan and you were walking through a village, and the village, let's say the women in the village and the children were really saying things that you could feel were angry and negative. I said, "Did you react?" And he said to me, no, I didn't react. So I said, "So you realized that at that point you did have control and you could navigate your way through that?" And he went, "Absolutely." So I said, "So how come at home with your children and your wife, you're not demonstrating the same attributes and the strengths?" And he went, "Ah." And the minute he got it, he was able to start taking personal responsibility for his own healing so that others around him didn't become casualties. And I think part of our transitioning process is, whether we're in tribe or within family, is we have to take responsibility and not make others the waste bin of the emotions and the rage and the anger and the hurt that they shouldn't be taking on. So that's respect for self. The other R was also, which fits in as well, is what is your responsibility to yourself? And I know, and we all know, that for many people, whether you're a first responder, veteran, or just a human being on a journey, in adversity, we tend to neglect who we are. We overeat, we don't exercise, we drink too much, and we go down a slippery, dark hole. And I think part of it is we can acknowledge that in the darkness where there is no light, sometimes it's difficult to care for who we are, but with help or even a tribe to remind us how critical it is to take responsibility. And I've often said that that responsibility is about, what are you willing to do to get back into the driver's seat in your vehicle as you're journeying through the storm. And as I said last time, part of your responsibility is small moments of taking charge of your life, small moments of moving through discomfort where you may not even be making your bed, but make your bed. You may not have eaten breakfast, or you don't eat lunch, or you're eating junk. Is try and have one good meal a day. You don't exercise, you're putting on weight. Well, it might be about just a gentle walk around the block. So it's about starting to take responsibility. And when we start to take responsibility, we immediately feel a sense of control and ownership of our journey. And the one thing I do know is that transitioning, as we've heard so many people saying it can really be a journey into hell and back. It's a journey into the darkest parts of our lives and ourselves, and trying to recover and refine who we are and where we are. And when we begin to take charge of certain things in our life, we may still be in that darkness, but the light and the flicker of the light is, I still make my bed. I will give myself, I'm worth feeding. I'm worth doing something gentle that looks after who I am. I'm worth picking up the phone and calling a mate and having a conversation. Then the I is for the integrity. And, part of the integrity of the journey is the willingness that if you are going to transition, ask yourself if you are willing to do what needs to be done, no matter what. And, it's when I took on that ultra marathon, I thought I had all of these nailed. I'd done all the training, months and months of endless running. I had a mentor. But when I was training, all these voices started to say, this is hard, and I don't want to do it, and I'm not strong enough. But I'd worked at my integrity to myself. I knew this was something I wanted. I knew it was something I was going to give myself. And I knew that if the fire of my will was strong, I was not going to lose who I was. And I think that in the process of transitioning, there are going to be doubts. You will face the ghosts of your past that whisper in your ears and tell you, you're not good enough. And we know that the imposter syndrome, or the guilt and the shame that we carry, and those ancestors and the ghosts that come in, they tap into that shame. They tap into the not good enough. They tap into the imposter syndrome. So in the end, we're left sitting in a corner feeling as if we don't have any worth at all. And I know that even when I got that, my greatest learning was still not there. My greatest learning was when I was injured at 64 kilometers and I still had another 24 to go. And I had no carbos left. I had nothing. I was empty inside. And I was at a place at complete desperation and fear, because I'd invested everything. I knew I was going to run or die. But when I got to the edge of thinking that I was actually going to die because I had nothing left and I was in terrible pain, it was, who was I and what was I going to do in that place? Now, there were two things. At that point, my integrity to myself kicked in. I went, I can do this. And I know that if I step out of the journey now, I have to live with that for the rest of my life. And I know if there are people listening to this today, you may be at that point in your journey where it's just, there's no hope. I am not able to carry on. I don't want to carry on. I'm worthless. I'm a burden. Everybody in the world would be better off without me. And I think that at that point in time with tribe, because on the marathon I ran, you're surrounded by people, and people can actually carry you over the line, and it counts. And so that being surrounded by tribe as I was thumping my way through, plus firing up my will and my integrity to myself, because I'd made a choice, that took me across the finishing line. It wasn't my best race, but it was my best race because I had to face myself in the darkness of my journey. And I think for everyone who's transitioning, some of you may transition incredibly effectively, but some of you may get to the point where you are facing the darkness of your soul in many ways. And then O was for how observant or reactive are you? And I think that's a critical thing we need to look at, because, you know, we know how important it is to identify arcs of fire. And the arc of fire, for those folk that don't understand it, is it controls where you are firing your weapon. So it means you don't hit people around you, and everybody has their arc of fire. And I think part of the transitioning process is be careful about what you focus on, because if you don't focus on it effectively, and if you haven't processed and taken responsibility for what's happening and reframed and worked at your wounds and your pain and your grief and your loss, you're going to move into reactivity. You're going to become like a runaway gun. And so that ability to do a 360 daily around you, to look at where am I? How am I in my family? How am I at work? How am I with my friends? How am I to myself? That being able to observe, and so it's almost like go OP, go to the top of the hill and look down, not go in your ambush zone and try and look out. But that ability to do that and the tools to be able to do that help ensure that all the other ones, your will to change, adjust and adapt, respect for yourself, integrity, and ensuring a successful transitioning process, it helps all of that. And finally, it's often we leave quite a trail of damage. I know, you know, I left such turbulence behind myself year after year, whether it was turbulence towards myself as I was changing, and turbulence to others as I was not navigating my way effectively through relationships, and almost just that sense of the war and the mess, and nothing. I was never staying long enough to ground, and so that sense of belonging. You know, I was avoiding belonging, and so we make a mess of our relationships towards ourselves and our relationships towards others. So finally, when you understand that the attributes, or the acronym warrior, is a reflective process that is critical before we even think about transitioning. We need to be very clear and have a critical, hard, cold, self-compassionate look at who we are, what we carry. And if we feel we're not able to do it, we need to get some help before we start putting our foot on the journey. Then I say that often what's useful to do is take a page and divide it into 3 columns. The first column is stuff that you've achieved. And that's a great bit of journaling, because in those moments when you feel you're not worth anything to yourself or others around you, you know, you haven't succeeded in anything, write down what you have done well, even if it was prior to transitioning. Who were you? What did you do well? What were your values and your strengths? The middle column is what are the things you are working on now and that you are willing to work on now. And it could be, I'm aware of my grief. I'm aware of loss of identity, sense of purpose, sense of belonging, my skill sets. So those are the things that you know that you can begin to work on and are working on. And the last column is what I call the big stuff, which is probably the stuff you're not going to do on your own. So those could be things like post-traumatic stress, impacts of blast injuries, things that are complex and need help. Then you have that up on your wall, and you've got a bit of a map to guide you forward. And as you work on things and you experience resolution, you shift column 2 to column 1. As things come up, you can decide whether they are a column 3 issue or a column 2 issue. But that, without a map, we have no compass. Without a compass, we can't navigate. So for me, this is the beginning of the journey. And unless we nail this and get help to do it, we kind of moving into the unknown without much insight or outsight. And you know, that place between leaving and arriving, so leaving wherever you've gone from to arriving to where you think you want to be, is an undefined place. And how we navigate through that, because often the signposts are not clear. And if we don't know how to look for the signposts, and if we don't know how to identify the territory, it's so easy to get lost. But when we start to understand the layers inherent in the transitioning, and you know, now I think people have nailed it pretty well. We know loss of tribe, loss of self, loss of skill sets, belonging, identity, shame, not good enough, moral injuries. We know when we know these things and we're transitioning, we can go, I get it. Yep. Now I'm at the imposter hill. Now I'm at the moral injury hill. And how we climb that then is the next challenge. But knowing the map and orientating your compass before you begin and while you're in the process is critical. So even in transitioning, it's a reflective process all the time where we're folding back on ourselves in the fire, we're being hammered out, and we come out with greater skill set. It can't be smooth sailing. No growth is smooth sailing. So that's the first thing. And I'm just wondering what thoughts have come up before I move more on and build on that. Any thoughts that come up? Jason, I'm gonna nail you.
Will cause a lot of thoughts to come up. So not a singular, many, many, many. How should I say? I look, as you say, the path of destruction you left. And so I can look at both law enforcement and military in the United States have high divorce rates, so somewhere between 90 and 95%. And with it, it's really that we did not learn how to process, whether we're actively in the military or law enforcement, things like that. So we never learned how to effectively process everything we're dealing with. As you said, that we look to our family and they can become the enemy. And something I look with the military, I deployed to a combat zone. But in law enforcement, I drove to work. And in the latter years of my career, I had a take-home car or a take-home motorcycle. And so literally, I'm in uniform or armed going to and from work. There's no downtime in between there. You know, and maybe I'm leaving my house leaving my house due to a crisis call, or I'm getting called out in the middle of the night from a crisis call. So I have no decompression time. And so all that darkness that you were discussing, you know, finding your way in that dark, it can be very hard while we're in the thick of it. And those are some discussions I've had with some other people who work with post-traumatic stress. I'm like, there's one thing to work with them after they're out, but it's another thing to work with them while they're in it.
Yeah.
And so, you know, there's so many different things, and it's amazing how our family can become the enemy when that's what we were doing things to love and protect and provide for. So it's just so interesting how we can turn that and, you know, and destroy those relationships.
Yeah.
A couple of my thoughts, though.
Yeah, no, thanks. Thanks. And I think we really have to be careful about the turbulence and the damage we can cause around us. You know, it's a bit like a traumatic blast injury, except we the IEDs. And boy, when we let go, it creates a wave that just ripples through everything and everyone, even the people we love. And then, of course, there's the impact of the shame and the guilt and the anger when we see the impact that we have on those. And so this thing with transitioning, with all these things that do come out, it is so easy to leave a trail of destruction that we then have to deal with. Where our hearts, the pain we feel for what we've caused. And unless we can navigate effectively, each step is adding more burdens onto the backpack we're carrying instead of removing those burdens. Yeah. Patrick, what comes up for you?
A lot. I think that we can certainly build on any piece of this. I like your benchmarks and the acronyms that you use, especially the warrior acronym. I joke often with Sarah about the overused words, and warrior is one of those words where it's misplaced so often. And when you look it up, the definition is a person who's warlike. That doesn't really encapsulate the creed and the ethic and the motto and everything. I think that if I was having this discussion with a person who's struggling, which I often do, I think there are a couple of things I would add to our discussion. And you talked about your marathon where you were at the breaking point, but found within yourself the ability to push through. And that is not a momentary skill. It's not something that occurs in the moment that we need it. It's something that we have to build throughout our life. And we have to be crushed a few times to actually build that, because I think that our biggest successes are the ones that come after failure and repeated failure when we're finally able to overcome that obstacle. And I think that my suggestion to people, again, if they were struggling, would be to start building small successes. And you mentioned this. You said, make your bed regardless. Because there is a tiny moral victory that takes 2 minutes to accomplish. And it's one thing checked off your list. And it's a moral victory that stays without you throughout that day, because every time you come back into your room, you don't see a disheveled mess. You see one piece, one small thing that you were able to accomplish. I think that that's where your resolve and ability to make it through that marathon came from, was finding smaller successes and building upon them. Because if we don't have a blueprint for success and a blueprint for tenacity and persistence and perseverance to overcome, then in that moment when we're struggling, it becomes hard to create one. I have a friend, and he is a world-class rowing and paddling coach. So he teaches kayakers and paddle boarders techniques to improve their skill. And he quotes, I believe it was a Japanese master, because he spent a lot of time there, but the quote is, practice hard things in easy waters. And so if we were all to take on the marathon like you did as our first task to accomplish victory, that's a bit ambitious. We have to start with a smaller task. And it may be, like you said, making the bed every day, but it has to be something where we can achieve success and we have to work at it. And so I just, I think I'm echoing what you said, but I'm reframing it in words that make sense to me and comparisons that make sense to me.
And it's interesting, as you were talking, I think it's critical that we are willing to push into the change and understand who we are in that process and find small things to create strength. But I also think we push out, but there's also the pushing into, and that's the pushing into our hearts and our souls. And what's interesting for me is that, I was a fighting medic. So I worked in 4-man sticks, and I was all my drips and drugs, and we could do everything from cut downs, drips, stitches. There was nothing we couldn't do before the choppers came to take people away. And so I learned to become very comfortable in high states of chaos. Guys in thorn bushes trying to stick drips and drugs in. I remember turning around, having a cannula in my leg, working on the guy, filling a syringe up and ramming it into my leg with antibiotics so I didn't get blood poisoning. And I was very comfortable with all of that. I was very comfortable at a point where I pulled a guy, he'd been ambushed. He was literally burning to death at 2 o'clock in the morning. I brought him back. I tried to get a thing down his throat. And I remember that last breath at about 2:30 in the morning. And I felt fine. Except when I was at university after that, I was working with a black patient. I worked in a mental hospital, and in apartheid South Africa, if a black person struggled with something and he struggled with bronchiectasis and he tried to kill himself, they put you in a mental hospital. So it was another time and another. But I became very close to this guy through an interpreter. He went into cardiac arrest, and the interpreter called me. And so I got on top of this guy and trying to save his life. And one of the doctors with a dubious history came past, and I went, "You need to get to this." And he went, "You deal with it. I'm just off to administer shock therapy." And the guy died under my hands. I got home and I slid down the wall in tears. Now, I remember the tears were not just about that moment. It was all the other stuff I'd never felt. And I'm still really good. I can go into high levels of chaos and I'm okay. But I also realized that something happened that changed almost my emotional cycle, is that I could go into quite a clinical cold space. And a thing that informed that was we'd been on patrol, and the four of us were up on a hill in the middle of the bush in Rhodesia, and we saw what looked like 10 terrorists in overalls and things over their shoulders about 200 meters away. And the tracker and I took off, and he went around one side of the hill, I went up the hill, and we were going to deal with them. And once we identified that, and thank God, I'd got one guy in my sights, and after about 30 seconds, he called me down, and they were innocent farm workers. But at that point, there was no fear. And what I know in my transitioning and in the people I love and who I'm with, I know there's a tendency, and I've seen it in the guys, that we can become quite cold. Especially when we're hyper aroused, we can go to a very cold place in which anything is possible. Our sine wave, I always say veterans, first responders have a different kind of emotional sine wave. We feel things differently, and we kind of look like we don't feel, but we do. But there's something different about it. It's often say we've got the dial down switch. And that's something subtle in the transitioning process that it took me a long time to identify. And so part of it is, how do we work not just on the external, but also our hearts, and how we bring that into situations when we are aroused or angry or anxious or depressed or reactive. Because, geez, we can go into a very cold, unfeeling space. So, yeah, that really triggered that, because we are changed. You know, there's no such thing as, I always say, there's no such thing as an unwounded first responder or a veteran. There's just isn't. And that wound is so subtle and interwoven almost within the marrow of our bones and our worlds that it's difficult to kind of pull the threads apart. And so part of the transitioning process is, as we have conversations, looking at these uncomfortable things, because they are uncomfortable, and know that we're not monsters. There's nothing pathological about us. We are who we are, and there are strengths within that as we begin to heal them. Sarah, I don't know what's coming up for you, if anything.
It's just really, I'm just tracking. I'm just absorbing everything. It's just such a process. I mean, that people have to go through, and appreciating the people who are willing to do what you're talking about, to really take that step into not being comfortable, to get into the mess and heal. So, and just appreciating, again, the way that you express it, the language that you use. I just think it's important stuff. So,
Well, you know, transitioning is the interaction between what's happening in our outside worlds and what's happening internally within us. And we can't ignore one for the other. They both have to have a place. And it's often easier to focus on coaching into the external world in the transitioning process and not looking into our hearts. But if we negate the deeper parts of ourself, they will find themselves in our present. It's like I always say, those internal parts are like, I think I said it last time, the wolves we run away from. The wolves are all the unfinished, kind of dealt with parts of ourselves that are a little bit messy and painful. And we can run away from them, but those wolves are always 30 meters behind us. And sometime there's going to come a time, chronology will even stop you doing what you do to keep running away from their wolves. And then they sit around you in a circle and they look. And at that time, they call you to accountability. And I mean, I think it's better if on the transitioning journey, rather than waiting for those wolves to sit around us, which generally happens when we have a total blowout and we end up in a therapeutic center or really in a very bad way, or choosing not to live, if we start to prepare for those wolves. So they're the wolves in our world, the external world, and they're the wolves that journey with us internally. And we need to be able to track those on our transitioning journey. And that's, I think, what makes it so difficult. It's not just a management process in which you can coach in the skills to go to your next job or to be a civilian. There's all these subtle levels of territory that live internally and externally. And what do we do with those? How do we understand them if there's no context or map for us? Where do we find the map? Jason, anything coming up or thoughts around this?
Well, you always do a great job of evoking a lot of thought. So, I was thinking about how you said that you could be the medic and doing everything you needed to. And as you were saying, you didn't even think about it, basically. You're using the other word of being cold. I would say we would frequently use the word calloused.
Yeah.
Especially in law enforcement, we get calloused to
Yeah.
seeing the different things.
Yeah.
But what I see typical in the PTS is remove you from that hostile situation, and now you got to deal with it. And the trigger that we would look at is we don't know what the trigger is going to be, So took you being on that man to recall that incident years before, and then how it left you, in shambles.
Yeah.
And so, we can look at like the suicide rates of both law enforcement and military, how there's so much afterwards, because now they're out of the thick of it. There's that downtime. All those things can come about and replay in their minds. And so my wife and I, we both do a lot of writing with people with trauma, but our mind has recorded every single part of that trauma. It can recall the temperature. It took in all of our senses at that time. And so that trigger might be, we hear a language, we make that scent, and it throws us back. And then it's how are we dealing with that, and not realizing, okay, that is a natural reaction to trauma that literally we stuffed down for a long time.
Yep. And so often, we think about, well, we're going to leave who we were, and now we're going to begin this journey. But in the letting go and the leaving, something starts to come up. It's like Mark said today. He said, it was when I stopped becoming a Navy SEAL and I walked away and was working on all the injuries, I suddenly felt all the grief that was in my body. And it's often when we stop doing that we start being. And that's when it can get tricky and it gets hurt, it's sore. And I don't think people realize sometimes that in the transitioning process, it's not just about the leaving, but when you leave, everything that has not had a chance to speak to you may start to knock on your door. And it's just to be aware of it. It's nothing to be scared of, because it's just energy in our body. It's just a part of ourselves that is saying, hey, for the last 10 years or 20 years, we've kind of sat in the back room, but we'd love to have a conversation now. We'd like to come out. Would you be willing to listen to us? and it's being ready for that, you know. So it's not just the mechanics of going from A to B. There's internal journeys as well. So we were looking at a kind of the external map and the internal map. Patrick, any thoughts? You muted.
That was the most wise thing I ever said. And now I don't know. I don't think that the ability to become cold when it is needed, it makes us a monster.
No.
But I think that scares us, because being able in a combat environment, a very high risk environment, to do something like sometimes kill a person, or operate in that environment comfortably, or find humor in a very tragic, dark situation, which is what keeps us alive. I think that could be scary when we reflect on it later. And we don't understand the mechanism behind that. I think that that ability to, in the edge that we have sometimes is our hyper arousal and hypersensitivity, the state that we live in, which is actually called and defined as post-traumatic stress injury. And that injury to our brain, we think that we can't survive without that constant adrenaline and that fight or flight. But the truth is that once you've learned it, you actually can. And the ability to turn it on or off as is needed is a skill that doesn't go away. I know if we were sitting together at a coffee shop having this discussion and we heard shots ring out, multiple shots and people screaming, I know that all of you, we would fall into function mode, whatever it is, perhaps running towards the gunfire, and there would be no hesitation, or grabbing people and shuffling them into a safe place and protecting them, or administering first aid, or whatever it is. I know that without having ever worked with you guys, but just hearing your attitude, that you would fall in right behind me or in front of me, and we go together. And so we have this fear that we'd lose our edge if we lose our edginess. And we don't have to, because it comes on and off. And when we begin the healing process and are confronted by those demons that haunt us, that can be scary, but it's truly something we've been prepared for all our lives, doing what we do. And you spoke of wolves. Can I share something with you that was shared with me? I was 16 and I was in a police explorer academy where we went through all the training. And one of the instructors read this. It is not credited to an author, and it is credited to Native American proverb. And it's called The Eagle and the Wolf. And you were talking about this, Barry, in your own words. There is a great battle that rages inside of me. One side is the soaring eagle. Everything that the eagle stands for is good and true and beautiful, and it soars above the clouds. Even though it dips down into the valleys, it lays its eggs on the mountaintops. The other side of me is the howling wolf, and that raging, howling wolf represents the worst that's in me. He eats upon my downfalls and justifies himself by his presence in the pack. Who wins this great battle? The one that I feed.
Yeah.
And so it still impacts me to this day. But as you speak of the wolf, I just happened to have this, and I thought, I'm not going to purge that file. It's too important to me. So,
and it's a thing we do feed. And I think, thanks, Patrick. I mean, that's very powerful. And I love the whole American Indian kind of way of seeing things. You know, I remember I bought endless books. I have a very strong connection with them. And I remember the creature of the South was the mouse, because he sees everything from close up. Everything seems huge. The eagle gives you distance. So the eagle's in OP, the mouse in the ambush zone. And then I think there was the buffalo on the west, and I can't remember the north. But these are the animals, the totem animals, the figures that we will face as we journey. So I was thinking about, to finish off today, I wrote, I might try reading it. How do I? Yeah, let me. It's a poem in terms of a lot of people struggle with, and it encapsulated. It encapsulated the stories I heard from the people I was sitting with, and how these stories and what we do with these stories that live in our body. And it was a poem I called "How Do I," and it goes, "How do I make my peace with the killing? How do I find peace from the nightmares that haunt my sleep and dreams? How do I forget the lifeless eyes of a child or my brother lying still and bleeding in the grass? How do I silence the sounds of screaming and pain that still haunt me? How do I talk of the fear that continues to this day? How do I switch off the hypervigilance that exhausts me? How do I find a moment of peace away from the war that still rages in my brain? How do I numb the pain that has closed my heart to everyone I love? How do I awaken my heart from the numbness that has stilled my feelings? How do I make you understand the grief, the pain, the loss, the fear, the rage? How do I ask for help when there are no words to speak? How do I ask for help, the help I need, when help is the last thing I want? How do I ask for forgiveness for the pain I have brought into your life? How do I undo the damage that my rage has caused? How do I break down the walls that I have built around myself to protect me from the world and others? How do I break down the walls that I have built to protect others from the nightmares and rage that live within me? How do I find hope during the moments when I wish to embrace death? How do I find life in my memories of death? How do I let go of the ghosts that live beside me and within me every minute of my day and night? How do I ask you to hold me when my heart is bleeding with pain? How do I find my home in this place beyond the war? How will I no longer need to drink the pain away? How do I tell my story without the fear of seeing the horror in your eyes? How do I? And I think, this how do I find my place in this journey? It can be as complicated and as challenging as that. But I do know that, we talk a lot about PTS and combat and all the issues, but I believe we need more and more conversations just about transitioning, because in transitioning, we're moving back into ourselves and our hearts, and we're moving into a new world. And the more we have these conversations, I think the more we can begin to heal through the sharing of stories. And I mean, that would be a goal that I'd love eventually for people like Mark, and there's other extraordinary people who've done so much around their transitioning journeys. As we share these conversations, we create a variety of maps that help inform people going from A to B, so that along the way or when they arrive, they no longer need to choose death. So I don't know. We'll work at this one. We'll see where we go. It's a beautiful journey. Start somewhere. I always work on the basis of just change one leaf at a time. So again, I just want to say thanks. It's such a gift to gather with you guys. And for all of those that are listening, feel free to come and join anytime, or even just listen. The goal is to create change where people feel they can embrace life rather than need to embrace death in this process of transitioning. So thank you.